atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by political scientist Michael Levy. Hey, Michael, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Mike. I'm doing well. I hope you're well. You know, I got some feedback from my mom from our show 2 weeks ago. She said it was like two old men talking about philosophy. So I promised her no discussion of epistemic humility or talk of Burke or Hume. And I hope you can help me keep that promise to my mom.
I will do my best. I may be epistematically humble, I think that's the right way, but maybe I won't actually. I'll just throw that out the window. Well, we'll see, because we certainly have a lot of things that if you're interested in outrage, especially if you're on the left, boy, this is yet another good week for you, I guess. So with that, I'll kind of let you kick things off for us, Michael.
Yeah, we're going to start the show with a segment on what's going on in Minneapolis, with an update on the shooting of Renee Good during an ICE operation on January 7th and everything that has unfolded since Saturday, January 10th, when you and Trey talked about it on the show. It's not really surprising because this is a monocultural moment. About 80% of Americans have actually seen the video of the shooting. And I know we try to keep these intros short, but there's so much to cover.
Yeah.
I'll try to be quick and get through it, but probably useful to set a timestamp that we're recording at 9:30 Eastern Time on Saturday, January 10th, since a lot of stuff might happen right after we go off the air. Earlier this week, the Justice Department formally announced there will be no independent federal investigation into the ICE agent who fired the shots, though they are reportedly investigating Governor Walz and Mayor Frey for impeding immigration enforcement. Walz released a statement in which he said, in part, the only person not being investigated for the shooting of Renee Good is the federal agent who shot her. The decision not to investigate the shooting itself is pretty notable. In most fatal encounters involving federal law enforcement officers, internal and often independent reviews are standard. Polls taken since last week have shown some stark numbers. A Quinnipiac University poll found that a majority of Americans, 53%, believed the shooting was unjustified, compared with only 35% who said it was justified. There are the usual splits along party lines, with 77% of Republicans saying it was justified and 94% of Democrats saying it was unjustified. Lots of interesting results also from a YouGov Economist poll that I'm happy to get into later, but a couple numbers stood out. 47% of respondents and 50% of independents say ICE is making cities less safe, while 34% overall and 27% of independents say ICE is making cities more safe. And also 46% favor abolishing ICE. Meanwhile, DHS released a brief and somewhat cryptic statement earlier this week, trying to push its self-defense narrative, saying the officer who fired the shot suffered internal bleeding. No details have been provided yet, no hospitalization record, no medical description, no clarification about severity. But medically, to be clear, internal bleeding can mean anything from a minor bruise to something very serious. So the lack of specificity has raised more questions than it's answered. Adding to that uncertainty, the New York Times published a detailed frame-by-frame millisecond level analysis of the video. Their reporting suggests that key elements of the administration's public narrative do not neatly align with the footage that it shows. The fallout within the DOJ has been significant. 6 federal prosecutors in Minneapolis U.S. Attorney's Office have resigned following instructions from DOJ leadership to pursue investigative steps into Good's widow, rather than the shooting itself. On the street, tensions are rising. Protests have intensified, and the scale of federal presence is hard to ignore. There are now roughly 3,000 ICE agents operating in and around Minneapolis as part of what the DHS is calling Operation Metro Surge, compared with only 600 Minneapolis police officers. For many residents, this surge, combined with aggressive tactics, appears to have crossed a psychological threshold and prompted a local lawsuit about ICE tactics even before the Good shooting. And in that vein, late Friday night, before we recorded, a federal judge in Minnesota stepped in to limit how federal agents can respond to protests around the ICE enforcement operation. U.S. District Judge Catherine Menendez issued a preliminary injunction barring agents from retaliating against people engaging in peaceful, unobstructed protest activity. Under her order, federal officers are prohibited from using pepper spray or other non-lethal crowd controls on peaceful demonstrators and observers. And layered on top of all of this, President Trump has publicly suggested that he may consider invoking the Insurrection Act, potentially dramatically escalating the stakes. So yesterday, he seems to have backed down from that. The situation is so fluid that who knows what will be true by the time this episode is released. So, Mike, with all that introduction, let me throw a few questions at you that you can take in any order you want. You can answer any of them, none of them. But with the majority of the public, including independents, believing this shooting was unjustified, what does ruling out an independent investigation mean for the administration and the perceived legitimacy of ICE? And how do you square the inclination to investigate Good's widow rather than the shooting itself with claims that this administration is restoring law and order and transparency? And finally, given the scale of the federal presence and talk of the Insurrection Act, is this just a powder keg that's set to explode even further?
Well, I'll start with that last one because that's an easy one. Yes, I think it absolutely is a powder keg that's set to explode even further. And I think in the last night of demonstrations, in fact, we saw a number of arrests, and this is not surprising at all to me. But as to the independent investigation thing, I think at this point in the United States of America, there's no such thing, or at least most people don't believe there's such a thing as an independent investigation. I think the idea, especially on the MAGA side of things, that there is such an idea as independence, that's out the window. And what I see here is a sad but completely predictable outcome of a very much an us versus them mentality. And us, of course, is MAGA, the Trump administration, and the ICE agents, and them are the people of Minnesota, or Minneapolis in particular, who are protesting. And they feel like at this point they are the enemy. And so I think with you mentioned the 6 prosecutors in the Minneapolis, in the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office who resigned, senior people, most of them, I believe. And I think this totally makes sense, the investigation of Good's widow, because you need to back up the narrative. And of course, the narrative, it seems to me, in every single one of these incidents has been not, we will wait for the facts to come out, we're not going to prejudge, but these people are violent terrorists and insurrectionists. And so therefore, it's important to find the information that supports that narrative after the fact. And so this is not about, I don't think at this point, this is about law and order. At this point, I don't even think this is necessarily about immigration enforcement. This is about not backing down in the face of the enemy. And I think to the Trump administration, Miller, Trump, the ICE folks, Nome, the people of the protesters of Minneapolis are the enemy, and you can't back down, which is why I think this is almost certainly going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that you talked about no such thing as an independent investigation, because I was thinking about two things historically as I was doing the research. One, about independent investigations, because some of our listeners may remember Ruby Ridge back in 1992 that happened during the George H.W. Bush administration. Bill Barr, who was one of Trump's attorney generals in his first term, was also attorney general then. And there was an independent investigation. So, it was a Republican administration, a killing of a civilian. And so what a change in 34 years. But then I was also thinking about the protests. And I was wondering if we're approaching one of those moments like Selma or, with Bull Connor and the hoses and Kent State, or Chicago in 1968 outside the DNC, where it's not ideology for the public, but it's this perceived government overreach. American citizens just, I don't think, like seeing its government beat up its citizens. And so I'm kind of wondering what you think there, and especially when we think about the number of ICE agents in Minneapolis. And it's not clear exactly what the extent of the geographical extent of their scope is. But if I sort of take the number of agents and do that by the population in Minneapolis itself, that's one ICE agent per 320 or so people. If you take the whole metro region, then it'd be more like one in every 1,200. But it's just a massive police presence, or ICE presence, sorry.
Yeah. I guess on that, I think when I think about what Americans are for and against, I have to bifurcate or maybe trifurcate, I don't know, cut up into a number of pieces, because certainly I am one of those Americans, and I've seen a lot of video recently of what's been going on in Minneapolis, and it troubles me. It's not just me. I mean, Joe Rogan on his show this last week, was talking about militarized groups of people roaming the streets, snatching people up and saying, are we really going to be the Gestapo? And so
Joe Rogan's going woke.
Yeah, I mean, but and I think, though, it's important to keep in mind that there are a lot of Americans. I would go so far as to say tens of millions of Americans. I wouldn't be surprised to say, you know what? These protesters are getting what they deserved. And even I will go so far as to say there is a not tiny percentage of Americans who feel that Renee Good got what she deserved. And that if you get in the way of law enforcement, that's just too bad. You should know better. And I find that to be really hard to wrap my head around, but I've talked to enough people who seem to hold that view. And so that's why I think that things are not going to get better anytime soon. You mentioned some of that polling data, right? When the Quinnipiac poll, where 77% of Republicans said that the shooting was justified. I mean, I don't see how you can watch that video and come to that conclusion. I could see where you could say, well, I don't know, but clearly we're so divided on this issue and given the fact that Donald Trump has never seen a fire that he doesn't want to pour gasoline on, it just seems to me that I don't know how much worse things are going to get, but my concern, I guess, is twofold at least. One is that more people are going to be hurt and killed, and that's obviously a major concern. But a second concern is more political, is that I wonder the extent to which, at least maybe not for Donald Trump, but maybe for Stephen Miller and Noam, that they're trying to pull Democrats into a trap with the more of the kind of abolish ICE sort of thing, and this idea that, well, if you can get this sort of anti-ICE sentiment really, really wound up strong, especially through the primaries, which are going to be coming. Primary season is not all that long from now. Then maybe you get more moderate Democrats primaried by more anti-ICE folks who also are probably going to be further to the left on other things. Then you think, well, maybe those candidates are going to be weaker in a general election. I mean, this is sort of how it played out right in the last midterms when you saw some of those super MAGA people doing poorly in the midterms. And I'm wondering if at some level there are at least some people in the brain trust area who say, yes, let's really incentivize activist Democrats to get out there to really push progressive left folks into the general election so we have a better chance at controlling the House. I don't know. What do you think about that, Michael?
Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, one is just to go on to the point of the tactics and the protesters, in that, I don't know if you saw a video where one of the ICE agents was saying to one of the protesters, "Haven't you learned your lesson?" And that's pretty chilling stuff.
Yeah.
And it's very worrisome. And I do wonder, though, when you talk about almost as though the administration might have this, and I know you didn't say it this way, like a secret plan to bait
right.
protesters into getting violent.
Yeah.
And certainly, Minnesota protesters are really doubling down on Minnesota nice, right? Like, yes, they're engaging in tactics that are annoying to federal officials. And I'm sure some have been crossing the line. But even Renee Good herself, it's really stark. What were her last words? "I'm not mad at you."
Yeah.
That's what she said. And I mean, that's the kind of protester. I've seen a lot of videos of people saying they never protested before, but this has just shocked their sensibilities. And so I do, certainly if the protesters themselves turn violent, that will give a further justification to ICE agents to do the crackdown. And I could see some sort of ripple effect from there that could harm the Democrats. And the Democrats shouldn't fall into the trap of abolish ICE. And I think it was Senator Chris Murphy talked about, of course, we're going to need immigration and customs enforcement. But what we need to do is we need to reform. We need to have some rules in place about the types of activities, the types of when lethal force. when lethal force is actually permissible, I mean, that is laid out by the ICE manual. And I had gone through that and read through that. And this officer never followed what is actually in the ICE manual. But I'm kind of curious because you guys talked a little bit about this and you've had a week to reflect, Mike. Kind of wondering, what you make of the incident itself, and because I don't know if you've seen the frame by frame, the millisecond frame by New York Times, and et cetera, but I'm kind of curious what you make of it.
I think that there was an understandable rush to judgment, especially with the first video that I saw, which was the one that it seemed to me made it look to me very clearly that Good was trying to get away and get out of the way of the ICE agent. But I think to me, the point that I made back then that I'll make still now is that it's important not to rush to judgment on either side. And that, I mean, I believe in a presumption of innocence, especially for people who do think people I might not agree with, what they're doing. I certainly don't agree with the ICE enforcement actions, but the idea that the administration would just immediately knee-jerk say, no, this was fine. We're not going to investigate. We're not going to allow state and local authorities to be part of the investigation. And oh, by the way, she was a terrorist or a rioter or an inciter or something like that. To me, what this is this is not about law and order. This is not about justice. This is solely about crafting the narrative. And let me say, of course, politicians do that and administrations always do that. But I would like to think, and I think in most cases it's true, that that is done in the service of legitimate goals, even if I disagree with some of those goals. But here it seems like it's just power justifying power. And to me, that is so incredibly troubling, which is why I think what Governor Walz has said and what I think the mayor has said about calls for more filming, I think are really smart because you mentioned, are we at a Selma moment, the Kent State moment? Well, I think the more of these videos that come out there, I hope the more the conscience of the nation will be shocked by this sort of thing. I mean, if they've gotten to Joe Rogan already, maybe that's a good sign because it seems to me that this is clearly a policy that is deeply, deeply unpopular with a lot of the people in the areas in which it's being being carried out. And I think that should be a signal, but yet I just cannot see how the Trump administration has it in its DNA to back off on this. Although at least, you mentioned that President Trump seems to have backed off on the Insurrection Act thing, which is, I guess, something, I suppose. But I just think it's going to become more violent, and I just fear for what that means.
Do you remember in Trump's first term when he would do something that would seem a little bit magnanimous, that a lot of journalists would say, well, this was the week that Donald Trump became president. And I think about in his second term how he has, and I know I've used this phrase before, he's never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The shooting happens. He could have come out and said, we don't know all the facts. The ICE agents are out there enforcing the laws and trying to ensure that we take violent criminals off the street. This is a tragic event, and we're going to investigate. Like he could have, but he wants to lean into the strongman mentality that you kind of talked about with Stephen Miller, because you put this in the context. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get us off on a tangent about Venezuela and Greenland. But it is just this strongman mentality that might makes right, and we can do whatever we want to do because we have the big stick. But I sort of wonder, when I think about the hypocrisy here, and I try to put myself in a position if this had happened under a Democratic administration, would I be one of those people who was saying that it was whatever the federal government was doing justified? I like to say that I wouldn't, but want to at least be fair in that. But I'm sort of thinking about the hypocrisy here when many of the same voices that were demanding accountability for and calling Ashley Babbitt a hero during the violent protests in Washington, D.C. She was a woman who traveled across the country, entered federal property illegally, and tried to breach the speaker's lobby. Here's Renee Good, just drops her kid off at school. She's just very close to her home. And just kind of this stark difference in response about who quote unquote deserves to die. She's, Renee Good is a terrorist, and she deserves, maybe she didn't deserve to die from the administration's perspective, but they don't seem to care much about it. And they don't seem to mind trashing her name and bringing it through the mud. So anyway, but I'm kind of like wondering when we sort of like think about what comes next. I'm sort of curious, he backed off, Trump backed off of the Insurrection Act. And do you think even he sees that as a red line? Or like, I'm just trying to figure out, because he says a lot of things, right? Like, and we'll get to Iran a little bit later in the show, like, hey, I'm going to go bomb you, better not do this. And then Iran backs off. And so he backs off. And similar, like, oh, I'm going to invoke the Insurrection Act, and he backs off. But what do you think in there?
I think that Donald Trump is very mercurial, and that, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me if he invokes the Insurrection Act. If he's invoking it as we speak. Right? I think you mentioned Iran, right? When we said about Iran before the bombing last summer, and well, we're going to give them a couple weeks to go ahead and decide if they want to give up their nuclear weapons. Oh no, we're just going to send the B-2s in to the bunker busters, that sort of thing. And so I think he's just so hard to track. I just do not know. I guess the only thing I feel confident about is that he hates the idea of looking weak. And I think much more, I don't think he's a particularly strategic actor. I think he's got a really good nose for certain things, a really good kind of sense of certain things. But I think much more strategic actors like, say, a Stephen Miller can use that to influence the president on things, which is what I think might end up happening, which is why I would not be surprised if the Insurrection Act ends up being invoked in this case. And I guess, when I think about what Democrats can do at this point, there's been a lot of talk, of course, about with the January 30th funding deadline going on, and we've already passed 6 of the 12 funding bills, but DHS is still out there, and there's been talk about holding that up. I think that also could be problematic, because what a lot of people might not remember or recall is that, of course, ICE got tens of billions of dollars through the big, beautiful bill thing, which is entirely separate from the annual appropriations process. So if Democrats end up holding up funding for that, well, that also would hold up funding for things like TSA, the Coast Guard, that sort of thing. And do we really want to, do Democrats really want to be on the hook for that? Democrats, I say I'm just so used to doing that. It's practically muscle memory.
Yeah, Mike, you're not a Democrat.
I guess it's because what I feel like here is that the Trump administration has essentially turned the dial up to 11 on basically using process to punish people. The investigations of literal almost everyone, every prominent person who questions them in any way or tries to impede them in any way. And I want to be clear, I certainly agree that it is not legal to impede, to obstruct law enforcement officers, but that doesn't mean you can't film them, and that doesn't mean that, well, if you're impeding them, they can go ahead and pepper spray you or shoot you in the head or something like that. I mean, so it's just I don't see a good way out. I don't see any leverage for Democrats to try to enforce rule of law here, because when the administration doesn't care about rule of law, when the Department of Justice, it seems to me, has basically completely thrown away that used to be that semi-wall between themselves and the executive branch when it comes to deciding who to investigate and who to prosecute, there really doesn't seem to be much recourse, unfortunately, unless after the midterms, Democrats get a majority in the House, then there can be some congressional investigations. But even that, it's publicity, but it's really disheartening to me. I am certain that never in my lifetime as a politically aware person that I've seen an administration, Republican or Democrat, have so little concern for rule of law. And that to me is the most disturbing thing, not just for what it says right now, but for the precedent it potentially sets for future administrations, both Democrat and Republican.
But that's where I think, Mike, I went down a rabbit hole this week about the Wren case from, I think it was around 40, 50 years ago. And I sort of like wonder how much the Supreme Court is really kind of opened the floodgates to allow some of the tactics that ICE is engaging in to happen. So, for example, the Wren case tells officers that motive doesn't matter as long as they can point to some technical violation. So, somebody is speeding or they have a light out or something like that. And then there was a subsequent case. Brignone Ponce tells them that race and ethnicity can be one factor in suspicion. And then, California courts earlier this year, I was going to say, but in 2025, tried to draw real lines saying you can't stop people based on race, language, or where they live. The Supreme Court stepped in and stripped those injunctions of any force. So put together, there's this message on the ground is unmistakable, I think, for ICE. They have broad discretion in what they do and who they stop. Somebody looks Latino, well, let me ask them for their papers, and that it kind of encourages this aggressiveness. And I saw a video last night. It had nothing to do with this. It was a white person who was stopped in Tennessee, and it was just an officer who saw them running at 4 a.m, which I've been known to do, and he was heading to Walmart, and the guy and the person he stopped was just incredulous. Why are you asking me for my ID? What did I do? What law did I break? And the guy's just I can ask you for my ID. I can do it. And I think that particularly because this is immigration, whether it's Somali or Latino, and their people may look different, it's just given a lot of discretion. I think that's what's really gotten the hackles up of the Minneapolis folks, is that it's their neighbors, it's their friends. Businesses are closing down because their workers are afraid to go to work. Yeah. I was on the phone the other day with some folks from Minneapolis, and they're the schools, a lot of students aren't coming into school. Whistles are blowing to signal ICE action. It feels like, and I know, I've never been in a war, but it feels to them like some sort of war zone in America.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems with various court rulings, the Supreme Court ruling you mentioned, is that they were, at least in some way, even if not consciously, predicated on the idea that people in power, in law enforcement, need a lot of flexibility. And I agree. Yes. I understand that. But I think that the underlying assumption here was that, generally speaking, they would use this discretion wisely and decently, and that there would be a certain understanding about that has held, honestly, for a long, long time. And yet when you have when you have top administration officials saying ICE agents have absolute immunity, it's one thing to back up your people. It's another thing to say they can do whatever they want and they won't be held responsible for that. I think that is a world that the framers didn't envision, that I think the Supreme Court has still not really come to terms with. And so that flexibility that I agree is incredibly important if it is balanced by a certain amount of restraint and decency and humility. When you have an administration that cares, it seems to me, only about power and force and none of those other things, then all of a sudden those reasonable decisions, I think in most cases, become essentially a carte blanche to do whatever you want. And that's, I think, one of the many ways in which our laws, our entire system in many ways has just not kept pace with how polarized and how aggressive and how incredibly mean-spirited our society has become in many ways, particularly, I think, this administration.
Yeah, so two quick things, and maybe we can pivot to another subject, because I'm sure we could talk about this for a couple of hours. One, I want to fact check myself. The Brignone case was 75. The Wren case was 1996. So for any listeners, I want to make sure that I correct that. But your point on absolute immunity really kind of floored me and chilled me earlier this week, or when that statement was made. Yeah. And I'll just say something very simply. Of course they have absolute immunity, because we know that Donald Trump will pardon them. He has not been shy about the pardon power. Of course they don't have absolute immunity. They don't have carte blanche to do whatever they want to whomever they want. But the administration has made it clear that if you are a friend of the president, you will not be prosecuted. You will be pardoned. And if you are an enemy of the administration, you will have investigations. And that's why maybe it's a good opportunity for us to pivot over to an investigation of Jerome Powell.
Yeah, before we do that, let's just take a quick break and we will get right to that. All right, Michael. So, as you were saying, we wanted to move on to talk about another big story in the news this week. The
Yeah.
Powell, Trump versus Powell, I've been thinking of as.
Yeah, this was a hard week, Mike, because I found myself last night up till like 10 or 11 prepping for the show, and every time I thought I was done,
Yeah.
something came over the wires to tell me some headline. So, I think it's good to turn to the unprecedented clash between Trump and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. At the center of the dispute is a long-planned renovation of the Federal Reserve's headquarters in D.C. The project, which involves modernizing aging buildings for safety, security, and efficiency, was originally estimated at about $2 billion, a little under $2 billion. Over time, the figure rose to roughly $2.4 to $2.5 billion. Republicans seized on those overruns, arguing that Powell had misled Congress during testimony last year about the scope and cost. Powell has said the increases reflect inflation, supply chain disruptions, newly identified structural and safety requirements, and additional construction complexities related to DC's local building constraints. In recent weeks, the Justice Department has served grand jury subpoenas on the Federal Reserve tied to Powell's congressional testimony, raising the possibility of a criminal investigation. As of now, Powell has not been charged with any crime, and he pushed back forcefully, arguing that the investigation is politically motivated and intended to pressure the central bank. He released perhaps an unprecedented statement via video where he made his points extremely clear, saying that he would not be cowed by political intimidation or pressure. That recording was probably pretty brilliant. The recording has had 1.1 million views on YouTube, the most of any video by far on the Fed's YouTube channel, and it's only a week old. The fallout isn't limited to Powell's response. Adding another layer to this story is growing frustration inside the White House and among congressional Republicans over how the probe itself has been handled. Reporting suggests that Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News personality now serving as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and a close Trump ally, has drawn criticism from within the GOP for being overly aggressive and in some cases undisciplined in her approach. What was meant to be a forceful show of accountability is now for some Republicans looking like political overreach. This conflict also comes amidst the backdrop of Trump's long-running frustration with Powell over interest rates. Trump has repeatedly argued the Fed should cut interest rates more, while Powell has emphasized the Fed's dual mandate. Complicating matters further, Powell's term as Fed chair expires in May, though his position as a member of the Federal Reserve Board runs through 2028. That means Powell could decide to remain at the Fed even if Trump appoints a new chair, setting up the possibility of an extended institutional standoff. Some Republicans have expressed unease. Senator Tom Tillis, retiring Republican senator from North Carolina, said the investigation raises questions about the independence of the Federal Reserve and potentially the credibility of the Justice Department. Tillis went even further, warning that he could hold up or block any Trump nominees to the Federal Reserve until the matter is resolved, a threat that has real weight because as one of the members of the Banking Committee, he could block it going from the full Senate for a vote. Markets have reacted cautiously so far, but economists and former central bankers have warned that sustained political pressure on the Fed could undermine its credibility. So, Mike, let me turn this to you. Do you see this primarily as legitimate oversight and accountability around government spending and ensuring that government is not wasting money, or as a case of political pressure that's being used to influence an institution designed to be insulated from exactly this kind of fight?
Well, I wanted to start by not rushing to judgment here and actually taking a look at what we know about what's going on with the Fed renovation building project. And so I started there. And yes, it's significantly over budget. It originally came in at $1.9 billion in 2021. Now it's something like $2.5 billion. That's like a third above the initial estimate. Now that seems like a lot, right? But if you take a look across all OECD countries, large infrastructure projects routinely come in between 20 and 45% over initial cost estimates. And in this instance, I think post-COVID inflation has a lot to do with the overruns. And so right there, it seems to me, this is routine, basically. These overages are nothing surprising at all for a project of this size. And in terms of, well, what about taxpayer dollars going to that? What's oftentimes forgotten is that this isn't being funded through general revenues, but it's being funded internally by the Fed, which is how it gets essentially all of its funding through interest on the government securities that it holds. So it seems to me to be quite a stretch to argue that, especially in the post-COVID inflationary context, that this is some sort of malfeasance or some shocking cost overrun. So right then, I kind of reject that. It seems to me that, yeah, this is, in fact, political. And I guess to me, the big question is this something that Donald Trump himself has pushed? And because there's been a suggestion that, well, Trump wasn't aware of Powell's investigation, and basically what happened is that Bill Pulte, the FHFA head, kind of wrote this report, sent it to Powell, and they're both very eager to kind of earn points with the president. So hey, if we can give him a means to remove Powell for cause, it made me think about that whole Henry II thing, right? I said about Thomas Becket. This is back a ways, 11 something or other. But will no one rid me of this troublesome priest? And then a few of his knights took him literally and not seriously, and ended up killing Becket. And I guess the overrun here is that Henry appointed Becket as archbishop, but then he got really frustrated because Becket worked to preserve the independence of the church against Henry's power. So you can kind of see the parallels here, but I don't know if I believe that or not, but it isn't that much of a stretch because it sure does seem to me to be a politically bad move, an obviously bad move, given what everyone should know about the importance of the independence of the Fed, at least in the financial community, and even some top members of Trump's old own administration, including his Treasury Secretary. So, wow, this seems like a real unforced error. And as you pointed out, Michael, well, now I think even once Powell's term ends in May, I think he's going to feel a lot more inclined to say, listen, I'm not being pushed out, and I'll stay on the Fed board until 2028, which actually denies Trump another seat to a point. It also looks like it's going to be a lot harder for him to get sort of a hand-picked successor in as the new Fed chair. So, wow, this seems to have been a really, really bad play by whoever decided to push it.
Yeah, I mean, it is totally backfired. And some of the Republicans, it's not the usual suspect. I mentioned Tom Tillis. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, has talked about the Fed's independence and needing to proceed without political interference. Senator Kevin Cramer, hardly a liberal, said he flatly believed that Jerome Powell wasn't a criminal. And so there was a lot of Republican. And I think the markets have reacted cautiously in some ways, probably because they don't expect anything to come of this. But in your intro point where you talked a little about like whether Trump sort of like talked about like he didn't do this, he just found out about it on TV or from the news reports. And I have to laugh because when reporters were asking him recently about his $2,000 tariff check that he was going to send to Americans, he seemed shocked that he had actually mentioned that. I think he talks so much and he says so many things that he doesn't remember what the hell he's saying at all. But I also should add, Mike, you may not have talked about epistemic humility, but you did have a 12th century, medieval reference. So I think you're definitely on point for you today.
Yeah, but, it reminds me, the Trump thing reminds me of, I think it was an old episode of Family Guy where Lois says to Peter Griffin, are you listening to yourself, Peter? He said, I don't listen to half the stuff that I say, or something like that. And that seems to me to be a very Trumpian thing because he's such an instinctive guy. He's not a deep thinker. He just emotes. He reacts. He's like all id, essentially. And so I can understand, it doesn't seem crazy to me that he, I don't know. But it also, but there's another way. I think another thing that I want to put out there is that it's possible that all of this started, or at least all of this blew up because of, I guess you could call it suspicion and miscommunication. Here's what I mean. So what we know is that in late December, Fed officials get like pretty informal emails from a prosecutor who is working for Pirro, just saying, hey, can we get together and talk about this thing, about the renovations? Now, the Fed officials, understanding that the Trump revenge tour sort of thing, they say, well, maybe this means a formal investigation's coming. Say, we don't want to meet. Powell goes ahead and retains outside counsel. Well, then Pirro says, well, obviously that means the Fed is hiding something, stonewalling. They must have something to hide. And then this whole thing ratchets up. And I think what a lot of people maybe don't appreciate is how unusual this is in sort of the longer history of American government, when you oftentimes could handle things informally in certain ways without everyone just getting their back up and being incredibly suspicious right away. It's not to say everyone was holding hands and singing Kumbaya or anything like that. And I don't even know if this was the case here, but I think it illustrates how incredibly antagonistic and almost reflexively antagonistic this environment has made everyone. And it makes it so much harder to get things done and so much harder to de-escalate things.
Yeah, so I think there's a serious point beyond the drama of Trump and Powell and trying to remove him. But when I was looking at some of the quotes that came out recently, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan, talked about everyone we know believes in Fed independence. There was a Finnish central banker, Olli Rehn, any loss of U.S. Federal Reserve independence would push up inflation. But then I saw an interview with Art Laffer on CNN. Art Laffer, godfather of conservative supply-side economics. And he openly argued that the Fed should be under the thumb of the presidential administration, whether that's the Trump administration or a Biden administration. And so, I think that was pretty extraordinary to me. Like, it's not that I didn't know that argument was out there and from him, but I'm kind of wondering, like, does this signal potentially an attempt by some faction or some rump to maybe change the dynamics of monetary policy in the U.S.? Do you think this has legs after Trump is out of office, that the Fed shouldn't be an independent agency? Or do you think this is just a Trumpian 2.0 thing?
I hope it's just a Trumpian 2.0 thing. But I would not be surprised especially if, say, someone like a J.D. Vance ends up being the next president of the United States, that this isn't pushed a lot more. I think right now the Fed independence is going to hold, but if you take a very strong unitary executive approach, and I've come out saying that I am a supporter of a weaker version of the unitary executive, I think you can make a case that, well, no, there is no such thing as an independent executive agency. And the logic of that says, well, yes, then the Fed isn't really different. It seems to me that the Supreme Court is not willing to go that far yet. But, maybe Donald Trump's in office for 3 more years? Who knows if he gets another appointment to the court and a J.D. Vance becomes president and he gets an appointment or two to the court? That could possibly change, though I think there would be an awful lot of pushback against that sort of thing. And I hope Fed independence will hold, because I agree with Jamie Dimon and most of the rest of the financial community that would not be a good thing.
Well, let me push you in one more area on independence. So one of your favorite phrases on this show is jawboning. And so I'm sort of like wondering, about how presidents should behave when it comes to monetary policy. So there is the Fed's independence, but what do you think the line is? Whether, again, it's Barack Obama or Joe Biden or Donald Trump, because the Fed is not infallible, right? Yeah. And they have made mistakes in the past of a president saying, hey, I think that the Fed should lower interest rates, or what do you think that line is between, trying to use the bully pulpit versus going over the line and undermining that independence of the Fed?
I guess for me, the line would be I feel it's entirely appropriate for a president to disagree and strongly disagree with the Fed's interest rate decisions. But when it crosses over that into arguing that these people are incompetent, that they are acting criminally, or investigating them or otherwise pressuring them to do what you want, that to me is the line. But I certainly agree that the president can, and in fact, I believe should, be very clear about their disagreements with the Fed when they think the Fed's doing the wrong thing. But applying pressure, that to me is where that line is crossed, and very clearly that line has been crossed here.
Yeah, the funny thing is, whether it's Jerome Powell and the Open Market Committee or Democrats in Congress, there's a strong contingent of folks who are trying to save Donald Trump from himself. If the Fed did what Donald Trump wants them to do, inflation would get out of control. I mean, I think that there's no question if the Fed started reducing rates a half point a point, that there's going to be inflationary pressure. And the Democrats on healthcare trying to pass a 3-year extension of the enhanced healthcare subsidies. Everybody is trying to help Donald Trump except for Donald Trump.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with that, because I think that there are a lot of people who believe in a lot of or at least some of the things that animate MAGA, but believe that Donald Trump is just undisciplined and unfocused and gets in his own way, essentially, by being so focused on, well, he is focused on vengeance, certainly. He is focused on punishing his enemies, but sometimes punishing your enemies can get in the way of larger policy outcomes that you want to see. And so I think that there are a lot of folks in his orbit who get that and want to try to pull him off of the vengeance and more onto the policy. But that, I don't think, is Donald Trump's natural inclination when it comes to these things.
Yeah. And I'll plug a different podcast. I was listening to this week's episode. I think it dropped yesterday, the Ezra Klein Show, and Ezra was interviewing a conservative political analyst, Yuval Levin, and there was conversation around Trump's assistants, and are they trying to influence him? Are they trying to read his mind? Just, because I think even for his supporters, it would be charitable to say that Trump is erratic, but, that you sort of have that Trump is very erratic in his behavior, and that those around him are trying to create some sort of coherent consistency, even when that coherence doesn't exist for him.
Yeah. I think that's dead on. And I'll say that while I oftentimes find Ezra Klein difficult to listen to for a lot of reasons, I think he's at his best when he has conservative guests on, and those are almost always for me must listens.
Well, definitely recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what do you think? Should we move on and before we close, get into Iran?
Yeah, let's talk about maybe the most important internationally story.
Yeah.
That we have, outside of maybe Greenland and the breakdown of the NATO alliance. But over the last couple of weeks, Iran has been rocked by a new wave of nationwide protests, initially sparked by a collapsing economy, soaring prices, and a currency in free fall, but in many places quickly turning into open calls for regime change. By most credible counts, demonstrations have spread to roughly 180 to 200 Iranian cities, though the exact number is hard to verify because of the government's internet blackout and the way different organizations define a protest site. The demonstrations themselves began on December 28th as economic protests, and then evolved into something broader and more existential for the Republic. As with past protest waves in Iran, the 2009 Green Movement, the 2017-18 and 2019 economic protests, and the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, the government response has featured arrests, violence, and heavy information control. At the center is Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who ultimately has final say over major national security and political decisions. The elected president has formal authority over the executive branch, but Iran's system includes overlapping power centers, clerical oversight bodies, judiciary, security institutions like the Revolutionary Guard. In recent days, the reported death toll has climbed sharply. Reuters, citing U.S.-based human rights groups, reported that at least 2,571 people had died by January 14th. I think that number has gone up 100 or two since then. The Iranian government has also acknowledged roughly 2,000 deaths. The U.S. response has added another volatile layer. Trump initially urged Iranians to keep protesting and suggested that help is on its way, while declining to say what that actually meant. In recent days, though, he has pulled back from suggesting an imminent move, striking a more ambiguous and somewhat de-escalatory tone, and emphasizing that any American response would depend on how the Iranian government proceeds, particularly with respect to mass executions or further violence against protesters. Alongside that rhetoric, there are still signs of regional caution. U.S. officials have acknowledged adjustments to personnel posture at a major base in Qatar, though they've stressed that this does not amount to a full evacuation or preparation for immediate military action. So the big questions are, can the Iranian government contain this without fracturing? Do the protests sustain and broaden? And how might U.S. signals, whether rhetorical, economic, cyber, or military, shape what happens next? So, for example, Starlink coming in and providing internet access to get around the blockage that the Iranian administration has implemented.
Iran is one issue that I've really changed my mind on quite a lot. Back in the day, I was a supporter, a very vocal supporter on the podcast of the Iran nuclear deal, and I thought that the Trump administration was wrong. The first Trump administration was wrong to pull out, but I've really started to reconsider that. And at this point, I think that writ large, the Trump administration might actually have the better approach here. Here's why I say that. Before Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, their inflation rate wasn't great, like between 10 and 11%, and not horrible. But after the pullout and the reinstatement of sanctions, the economy just cratered. Inflation 30 to 50% level. And then, the whole argument for, of course, the nuclear deal was we want to make sure that their breakout time is very long. And they seem to decide, well, we're going to take a kinetic approach to that, essentially. And we bombed Iran last summer, right, with those bunker busters at the Fordo facility, and that pushed back their breakout time. And I was concerned about that with escalation worries, but that has not happened. And it just seems to me that Iran's regime was one that probably was never one we would be able to trust or talk to or really negotiate with in good faith, kind of like North Korea, I guess, would be another example. And so I think this approach makes a lot of sense. I'm concerned with, as I almost always am, with what I see as a lot of Trump's excesses, like, saying help is on the way, MIGA, right? And stranding these folks. It reminds me of the Bush thing with the Iraq back in the day. But I think in general, this seems to me to be probably a better approach to eventually push the Iranians to put in place a regime that actually is better for the people and better for the world and better for the United States. So that's not to say I don't have some problems, but generally speaking, I've been largely won over by the Trump approach on this.
So let me push you on that. So what does that actually mean? So I'm thinking about, obviously, we have context for what's going on in the world. And we have the recent regime change in Venezuela, where the administration takes out Maduro, and Delcy Rodriguez, his vice president, is now either the president or the interim president, whatever you want to call. She doesn't have in her past any, let's just say, centrist or democratic credentials to fall back on. But he in the administration seemed pretty happy with leaving her in place, even though that hasn't necessarily meant appreciable changes for the average Venezuelan. So I'm kind of wondering in Iran, that I know the old phrase is that regimes like this, that they die slowly and then all at once. And I'm sure that, I shouldn't say I'm sure, I feel fairly certain that the Iranian leadership will eventually crumble. But I don't know what comes in its place. And I wonder about the potential for the law of unintended consequences. Like, how aggressive does the U.S. get in here versus allowing that regime change to happen organically from within, from the Iranian people? Because if it feels like the U.S. is behind it, so for example, I'm not saying we're going to be putting boots on the ground, but if we take out the Iranian leader with a bomb or a missile or something, then does that create a rally effect for an anti-American regime to follow in its place? So, for example, the U.S. had backed the Shah, Pahlavi, for decades, and he had an enormous security apparatus, and the U.S. was seen as a puppet master, or at least putting him on the throne originally and supporting him, and that when he was eventually deposed all at once, then it brought a regime that was vehemently anti-American. So I just worry about, I'm not disagreeing with you that maybe the Trump administration and their more aggressive policy is maybe better than the Iran nuclear deal. But I'm just sort of like wondering what the end game is here, because I don't think Trump and his administration thinks about the end game. They just think about they're not playing 5 steps ahead. They're usually playing 1 step at a time.
Well, yeah, I agree, and I am always concerned about unintended consequences. But also, it's difficult for me to imagine a more anti-American regime replacing the
Yeah.
one. I mean, we've pretty much bottomed out, I feel, on that. And so that's less of a concern to me in Iran as it would be in certain other places, I suppose. And I guess I don't think this is about human rights. I don't think that the Trump administration is at all motivated by human rights or anything like that.
But,
You know,
but
you
he
mentioned,
just got the Nobel Peace Prize.
oh,
What are you
yeah.
talking about?
Exactly. What a proud moment for the country. I saw that picture and I thought, well, there's one leader in that picture, just one. But anyway,
Does this mean he gives the FIFA Peace Prize back? But anyway, sorry
yeah,
to
I said
interrupt.
he's going to keep. But and I think also this is about resources in a big way. I mean, Iran is still a major oil exporter. They're exporting around 2 million barrels per day. And there, if we talk about that, Middle East oil is some of the least expensive to pump out, the cheapest oil there is out there. And around right now, 80 to 90% of it is going to China. And so there are some really important geopolitical economic consequences. And certainly having a friendlier Iranian regime, one in which we could reduce sanctions and allow some of that oil to flow other places, that low-cost oil, I could see that being a really good thing. I guess I just see, again, bottom line for me is that Iran is in such a bad state right now that I don't really think things can get much worse. Of course, those are, kind of famous last words.
The China thing is really interesting, and I don't want to get us on a tangent, but I'm surprised by how quiet they've been,
Yeah.
both in Venezuela and Iran, because you're right with Iran. I mean, that's where they get a lot of their oil from. And just thinking about that I'm wondering what she is thinking about and how he's playing it, because he usually does play his cards closer to the vest than Trump. And I'm wondering what's going on there, because if the U.S., let's just say that there is a regime somehow that gets installed that is not as anti-American and rethinks its geostrategic relationships with the world, and how that could negatively impact China. So I'm curious there. Again, I haven't done enough research to have a view, but I have been curious.
Yeah, I'm not saying that Trump is playing, 4D chess and thinking 38 moves ahead or anything like that on this. But like you, I mean, I recognize that there are a lot of implications here, and I don't think anyone really thinks this is about the people of Iran any more than what we did in Venezuela was about the people of Venezuela. I think Trump sees both of these as there's a lot of oil in both those places, and let's do what we can to get it flowing to us.
Yeah, certainly, and I should note. I mean, from a progressive perspective here. I mean, I want to be absolutely clear-eyed about the Iranian regime's abuses. The people of Iran have been heroic over the last 20 years, since the first movements in 2008, and they have put their bodies on the line. If you sort of, I've met a lot of Iranian expats in the U.S., and and the folks in Iran, many of the younger ones, are more pro-Western or anti-regime, and it is heartening. Whether you look at the protests in Minneapolis, where people are putting their bodies on the line, like, I have to admit, I would be scared
Yeah.
to protest in Minnesota, because you just don't know what's going to happen if things get out of control. But these folks are doing it day in and day out, and knowing that they face the wrath of this kleptocratic criminal regime in Iran. And so how do we support them? But there are other folks who are putting their bodies on the line in other parts of the world. And so I do want to make sure that I end with this note that I don't support the Iranian regime.
No.
And
Yeah.
I'd wanted to see regime change. And the question is, how do you get that regime change? And I do worry, whether it's the Trump administration and bombing or Israel's impact, that all of that stuff can backfire. And how
Definitely.
the regime change needs to happen organically from within Iran. And it may be annoying because it's taking, now we're going on almost 50 years of this regime. And I would have thought that they would have been out of power probably about 15 years ago. But I do expect that they're going to go the way of Assad in Syria. And then all of a sudden, they're just going to be gone.
Yeah. And
that doesn't mean that things are going to be wonderful in Iran, but the regime is going to be replaced.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with you that. And I think it's less of a binary between organic and helping it along. The question being, well, how much do you want to incentivize or pressure regime change? And it can be a really difficult balance to figure out, and it can very easily backfire, as history has shown us time and time again.
I am just hoping that Donald Trump does not Truth Social or whatever you call it, truth out a Wikipedia page doctored to say that he's the supreme leader of Iran.
Yeah, like he did with
the further he is from this and having his fingerprints on it, I think the better it will be. But you're right, like there is going to be that tension between how much can we push without being seen as puppet masters, but trying to help light the fire.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we should close. And if there was anything Michael and I talked about in this episode you want to bring up, maybe you had a disagreement or have a question about, what have you, or even if you really liked it, we would love to hear from you, and you can get in touch with us in a lot of ways. There's our email, mail@politicsguys.com, Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes, and our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. Michael's on it. We recently had an interesting discussion about, there's all kinds of stuff, but we talked a little bit about my feelings about Mike Tomlin leaving the Steelers. It's not just politics on the Discord, though that is the main thing, but that's one thing you get as a supporter. You also get ad-free versions of everything we release. You get the full-length midweek episode instead of just the preview. And so we hope you'll consider doing that. Again, we always put support links in the show notes. And if a monthly contribution on Patreon, just something you can't do too much it's right now, and you still want to get those full midweek episodes, just let me know. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I will be happy to make sure that you can get the full-length midweek episode every single week. And whether you're a supporter or not a supporter, it really does help us out a lot if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you happen to be using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Brian Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. And we'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,